An F1 driver's helmet is often overlooked, but they are the last remaining part of the driver that we can still actually see, and perhaps the most important element of driver safety. So we are going to delve into the interesting history of racing drivers' helmets and understand how they've evolved over the decades, and answer some questions like, did drivers always wear helmets? How much does an F1 helmet actually cost? And what does a small female bug from India have to do with all of it? When cars first started racing back in the late 1890s, they weren't fast. In fact, horses were faster than cars, and at the time, nobody wore a helmet on a horse. So, the headgear of choice was a backward-facing cap and goggles. Hindsight is a wonderful thing, and now, looking back, it seems crazy that drivers didn't wear anything more than that, especially considering that, compared to today, driving a racing car was much more dangerous. Despite this, there was no great desire to make it safer. Actually, there were an awful lot of other things that were part and parcel of the sport which we now would see as outrageously dangerous, but they just took it in their stride. The racetracks would be lined with trees instead of guardrail. There was no separation between the cars and the spectators, and no seat belts. And the cars themselves were, in effect, huge crushable fuel tanks. But when motorsport was gaining traction in the early 1900s, life was just a lot more dangerous. Many of the early pioneers of the sport had fought in the world wars, so anything that involved not being shot at must have seemed like an improvement. However, things started to change in 1914 thanks to Dr. Eric Gardner. Despite having the incorrect number of wheels, it was actually the motorcycling world who made the biggest steps forward in the early days of helmet tech. Dr. Gardner, a medic on the Isle of Man TT, noted the large number of concussions over the previous year's races. So, he persuaded the rule makers to mandate that all riders should wear a newly developed helmet. And this is where that female bug comes in. The helmet was a pudding bowl shape that simply sat on top of the rider's head. It was made from layers of canvas bonded together by shellac. Shellac is a resin produced by the female lac bug and found on trees in India. In effect, this was an early form of fiberglass, and fiberglass would go on to feature heavily in helmets of the future. However, any big impact would be transferred straight through the shell, but they were certainly better than nothing at all. After the event, it was noted by the race medics that no riders suffered any concussions. They became a common sight on racetracks in the 1920s and 30s, however, cloth caps were still commonplace. Post-war, and it wasn't until 1952 that all F1 drivers had to wear helmets. One of the first companies to make helmets specifically designed for motorsport was the British company Evoque. Their early models were based on helmets worn by polo players. These helmets, although not universally worn, were soon adopted by a number of race drivers including Mike Hawthorn and Stirling Moss. They'd moved on a bit from the original shellac helmets, with more protection on the side of the head, along with an improved impact absorption with the addition of a cork lining, from where the helmet gets its name, along with leather for comfort. The face was still totally exposed, drivers often wearing surplus army dispatch rider goggles. Even then, drivers were decorating their helmets to better improve identification. Graham Hill's simple but very effective colours of dark blue with white stripes was a design that pays tribute to the London Rowing Club, of which he was a very active member. The evolution of the helmet paint schemes is an endless exploration of individuality. Early on, drivers would hand paint their helmets with pretty basic designs for simple identification. Today, they serve the same purpose, but highly skilled artists who specialise in helmet painting now create some truly stunning individual works of art. One of the biggest developments was in 1954, when Roy Richer started the Bell Helmet Company. Taking inspiration from the helmets worn by fighter pilots, he developed the Bell 500. In 1957, the new model, the Bell 500 TX, was the first motor racing helmet to pass the newly created Snell standard. This certification was named after William Pete Snell, who was sadly killed in what many considered to be a survivable accident. Some of his friends also happened to be doctors, and they developed a standard to force the progress in helmet safety. The Bell 500 TX had a hard fiberglass shell and a non-resilient plastic foam liner. This development basically meant that in the event of an impact, the liner would compress and absorb some of the energy, slowing the driver's head down and lessening the blow. It's essentially exactly the same theory used today. A Nomex fire retardant liner was added to the helmets in 1967, which was a unique requirement for racing drivers versus motorcyclists. At the time, fire in race cars was a very real risk. Where a bike rider would be thrown away from the machine, a driver could be trapped in the car. Drivers also started to wear Nomex balaclavas for extra protection. Up to 1968, all helmets were open face models, leaving the driver's face fully exposed. The first helmet with face protection came onto the scene courtesy of Bell, who created the Star. Bell developed it with the help of American F1 driver Dan Gurney, who, due to being taller than most of the drivers, was sick of getting hit in the face by stones. There was concern from the drivers that full-face helmets would be a disaster in the wet, with the visor steaming up, or, when it was hot, there wouldn't be enough airflow to keep them cool. But as it became clear that the improvements in safety outweighed these drawbacks, more and more drivers started to follow the trend. The visor covering the helmet's aperture was pretty basic. Some drivers, most notably Ronnie Peterson, favoured running with a peak attached to the visor, as you would find on open-face helmets. This must have created some very odd aerodynamic characteristics, and definitely would not be allowed by modern F1 designers. The 70s saw new brands appear on the scene, with Jebs and the Italian helmet manufacturer AGV, both producing innovative designs. AGV recognised that they could make a lighter helmet and supplied Niki Lauda in the 1976 season when he was with Ferrari. However, in the now famous incident at the Nürburgring, when Lauda's car veered off the track, crashing hard and bouncing back onto the road and catching fire, the helmet, for whatever reason, came off in the impact, and Lauda was trapped in the flaming car with only his Nomex balaclava covering just part of his head. Bravely pulled from the wreckage by fellow drivers, Lauda would be in a coma and actually had his last rites read to him. Heroically, Lauda quickly recovered and got back into the Ferrari and continued the rest of the season after only missing 2 races. 1977 saw, for the first time, the introduction by the FIA a new regulation which all helmets had to comply with. The regs focused around the materials used in its construction, the strap and the visor. In 1979 it was mandated that all helmets must be fitted with a medical air supply. After a series of fiery accidents where drivers were trapped in their cars and died as much by suffocating and smoke inhalation as any other reason. The logic was that if a driver was trapped, the air would provide precious time for them to be rescued. You can see the thick rubber tube on the side of the drivers' helmets from that era. Some drivers also wore a large Nomex scarf which attached to the base of the helmet for even more fire protection. In terms of what helmets looked like, there were some striking designs in the 80s. Bell was still popular and evolved its Star model with a few interesting variations, including the narrow aperture of the Bell Star Small Window, the Bell Star Super Small Window, and the unique double aperture of the Bell XF Twin Window. Simpson came onto the scene with the unique Stormtrooper-looking Bandit. But one of the most innovative helmets to be introduced at the time was from French company GPA. The way it fastened made this helmet unique. Instead of the conventional strap, the GPA had a twin horseshoe system which clipped together either side of the chin. This effectively clamped it onto the driver's head. By all accounts it was very comfortable, but questions were raised about the system after a number of incidents, most notably that of Gilles Villeneuve, when during his fatal crash at Zolder, the helmet came off. The FAA regulations brought some stability to the design and features of the helmets, and helmets started to look fairly similar. They were all made in pretty much the same way as they were in the 70s, with a solid outer shell, predominantly built from fiberglass, with an expanded polystyrene liner, then a foam and Nomex layer added for comfort. At the time, an F1 helmet could weigh around 2 kilograms. The late 70s and early 80s was the era of the ground effects, and the cornering forces of the cars were insane, even compared to today. Drivers could pull huge G when cornering, and with a 2 kilogram helmet, the driver would be facing enormous forces on their neck. In truth, helmet design for race drivers is a balancing act between making something incredibly strong versus making something light. Lightness is not just for comfort though. It has been learnt that one of the biggest issues a driver faces in a crash are the G-forces on their neck and spine. Reducing the helmet weight by just a few grams improves this effect exponentially. So, during the 90s, in the search to make helmets lighter while still retaining strength, a complex mix of materials was developed which would include fiberglass and Kevlar. These materials have their own unique properties that they bring to the construction of the helmet, allowing the helmet to withstand multiple impacts. As these materials were used, additional features could be added into the moulding of the helmet, and driver comfort was aided by the introduction of air vent systems. With more and more focus being put onto reducing the G-forces on the driver's head in the event of a crash, the FAA brought in a new helmet regulation in 2001. This effectively meant that all helmets would now weigh around 1.25 kilograms, thanks to being made almost entirely of carbon fibre. Another big change happened in 2003 when a new addition to the F1 driver's kit was added. The hands device was mandated to be worn to mitigate against frontal impacts. This is essentially a carbon fibre collar worn over the shoulders with a strap system that attaches to anchor points on the helmet, just below and behind the driver's ears. The collar is held in place with the car's safety belts, and during a big hit prevents the neck from hyperextending. There was some pushback from drivers who felt that they were too restrictive, but in truth, there's not much room to move your head in a Formula 1 car anyway, and like seatbelts, driving without one after you've got used to it would feel very odd. 2009, and at the Hungarian GP, Felipe Massa was struck on the head by a spring that had come off Rubens Barrichello's Brawn GP car. The spring struck just above the visor opening, leaving Massa with serious injuries just above his left eye and requiring surgery and the addition of a titanium plate. Although badly damaged, his Schubert helmet stood up well, but it highlighted just how exposed a single-seater driver is, and soon after, a Xylon strip at the top of the visor was mandated to minimise the exposed area of the driver's helmet aperture. Xylon is an incredibly tough material, twice as strong as Kevlar, and is used in various applications like body armour. In truth, the glued-on Xylon visor strip was just going to be a temporary measure. The FAA, along with Stilo, Bell, Schubert and ARAI, developed a new certification of helmet standards. The most noticeable change being a much narrower visor aperture, reminding us, maybe, of those early full-face Bell-style models of the 70s and 80s. Helmets like Schubert can be fully custom-made by laser scanning the driver's head and building the liner to fit perfectly. This does not come cheaply though, but in reality, anybody can buy a helmet that could be used in Formula 1. All major F1 helmet manufacturers sell their products used by F1 drivers to anyone and start at around £3,500 or nearly $4,500. F1 drivers will have custom fits done, but that will just be typically with lining pads. In terms of functionality, there are a few features that have been introduced along the way. F1 races are long and often held in hot climates, so some drivers will opt for a drink system to be fitted. It's basically a hole in the front of the chin bar and a pipe connected to a water bottle. Whenever a driver wants a drink, they push a button on the wheel and water is squirted into their mouth. Intercom systems are fitted into the helmet, and drivers wear custom moulded earpieces allowing for pit-to-car communication, but also to protect the driver's hearing. These earplugs even have accelerometers in, so the medical teams can identify the exact forces the driver has endured in the event of a crash. With the introduction of the Halo device, more and more is being done to try to protect the only exposed part of the driver that we can still see. There is certainly a resistance to fully enclosing the driver in the cockpit for a number of reasons, but I'm sure all race fans want to see them safe as well. If you enjoyed this, check out our other video where we look at the incredible evolution of the F1 pit stops. And if you're into F1 driving styles, we have a short playlist where we examine the driver's techniques.